Welcome to the Illinois Divorce Guide podcast, where we break down the complex and emotional process of divorce into manageable, easy-to-understand steps. I'm your host, Greer Howard, and with me is Bobby Buchanan, widely recognized as one of Illinois' top divorce attorneys, offering unmatched insight and experience in family law. Bobby, we are back today for another discussion, so thanks so much for being here, and we have a good one today. So I think a lot of times you think about when someone's going through a divorce, people can just assume, okay, well, this is a mutual thing. You know, both people want to get divorced, but it's actually very common, Bobby, that one spouse wants a divorce and the other spouse does not. I mean, how often do you see that in your practice?
Hey, Greer, great to be here. And I'm definitely excited to talk about this topic. It's certainly emotionally nuanced. We get, when I talk to new people or people who are calling lawyers for the first time, I ask the question, does your spouse know about the divorce, or have you talked about divorce with your spouse? And about 50% of the time, the answer is no. Because people come at this at different timelines. You might not come to this mutual resolution that you both need a divorce. Sometimes it's a very internal, personal thing where you've been thinking about it on the inside for months, if not years. And then you finally get the courage to present it to your spouse who's, for lack of a better word, blindsided by it. And a lot of emotions erupt from that space.
Yeah, I mean, I think talking about that emotional landscape is so huge when one person decides that they want to leave. And probably the person who is listening to us today is most likely that spouse that does want to leave. And so why don't we kind of start with that client? You said, gosh, it can be 50% of the people that come to you, and they are the ones that want out, and maybe they haven't had that conversation yet. So is there advice that you give them? Because it is just such an emotional process for that first step of knowing that your client wants to start this divorce process, but their spouse potentially has no idea. What do you tell that spouse?
Well, I usually ask them if they are clear on what they want to do. And just, that's plainly asking the question, well, do you want to get divorced? And if they clearly say yes, then we can go from there. If someone's on the fence and they say, well, I think so, or I'm not sure, or we might need to do some therapy first, or counseling, or I need to have a couple conversations with them to see if we can save this marriage, then that requires a whole different path. I think clarity is so important. Just getting clear on what you want to do next. It's like, if they're not clear, it doesn't seem like they're clear on the phone with me, then I'll ask them, well, why are you calling me? What were you hoping to get out of this call? And then we do an exploration together and figure it out. Usually there's always a specific reason of why they called the lawyer's office. It may not be because they want to get divorced, but they need to figure something else out. So I really like to drill down and figure out what it is that they're clear on, and then we know what the next step is. So let's assume that they're clear that they want to get divorced. And
that's a great point. Yeah, that they want the divorce. Most likely, if they're calling you or they're in your office, that's probably the direction that they're heading. And so why don't we give a little hypothetical here, Bobby? So let's say that Sam files for divorce. His wife, Julia, is stunned. She wants to go to therapy, and he's already talking to a lawyer. She thinks he's cold, and he thinks that she's in denial. What are your thoughts, Bobby?
Well, the first thing is, Sam made one mistake here already. And this really comes down to what I tell people when they do call us and they say, I want a divorce, which is, okay, let's slow down and take our time here. We don't need to act brashly. You shouldn't get off the phone with me and then go to your spouse and say, I just talked to a lawyer. We're doing this. I'm filing tomorrow. Like, that's just going to really make things unstable at home and not build bridges, which is what we want to do. We got to be kind and compassionate during this process. So unfortunately, Sam already filed here, and it is what it is. And what happens when you file is you're actually making this process public. And people don't realize that. Like, they may just go to the courthouse and say, well, how do I get a divorce? And then the clerk gives them a packet of paperwork, and they don't really know what they're doing, but they're signing documents, and then they're paying filing fees, and they're saying, well, I got the divorce started, so now it's going to go move on faster. Well, no, actually what you did was you just made this public, and there's attorneys that actually advertise based on looking at court filings, and they say, oh, here's a new one. I'm going to send a letter to the other side saying, looks like your husband filed for divorce. Do you need a lawyer? Like, I have had people shocked and go like, how did they find out? It's like, well, because you filed, and that's a public record. So we got to be really careful. You don't want your spouse finding out that you filed for divorce by getting a letter in the mail from another attorney. Like, that is.
I mean, Bobby, my mouth is on the floor hearing you talk about that, because I just think about, wow, what if you were the other spouse and you received something in the mail? I mean, that just sounds horrible. And, like you were saying, I mean, Sam, if he did go to therapy and they decided that was, divorce is where they're heading, maybe Sam and Julia could have come up with some things together before they filed. And that actually would make things go a little bit faster, if I've learned anything from you so far.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what I would probably recommend to Sam is like, hey, she might want to do therapy in order to save the marriage, but it's probably advantageous for you to be pretty agreeable to her at this point, because if you're just going to try to bulldoze this whole situation and she's not ready for it, then it's going to be like pulling teeth to get the divorce. And you're going to have to use the court system in order to push it through. And the court system is a very, very blunt instrument. And it takes a long time, causes more stress, more damage, more expensive. So if there's anything we can do to do this diplomatically, I highly, highly recommend it. And I get it. You've probably Sam's been thinking about divorce for like maybe a year, maybe 2 years, maybe 10 years. And he finally got the courage to do something. So now that he did, he's ready. But he's got to realize, like, his wife is not ready. She just found out about this. And that whole process of grief, bargaining, denial, like all of that, she has to go through that journey. And you can't accelerate an emotional process very easily. I mean, I think about it in the context of grief is the big one for me. I lost my dad about 6 years ago, and it was a whole process of grief before and after we lost him. And it's something that still continues. I mean, grief,
Absolutely.
There's no specific timeline to grief, and grieving your marriage is the same thing. You're going to grieve it before it ends, after it ends. You're going to grieve it. You might grieve it 10, 20 years later. And everybody needs their space to feel those feelings. And if you don't give them any space, it's going to be really tough to get through this, let's say, without there being a lot of, it's going to be tough to get through it without a lot of stress and expense in court.
Yeah, well, that's a really great way to think about the emotional side of it. And I think for our listener, just remembering that you and your spouse may be on different emotional timelines. And so that's something that, you just kind of need to give a little grace on, because, potentially if you're telling them, they have no idea. But let's move on to the legal side, Bobby. Let's talk about some of the legal parts here. Do you need your spouse's consent to get divorced?
No, absolutely not. So yes, on one hand, we need to give them as much, we don't need to give them, but strategically it makes sense to give them a lot of space to go down their own emotional path, which will ultimately probably save us time. But let's say just so you know, Sam, she doesn't need to get 100% on board for this to move forward. You don't need consent from the other spouse. Illinois is a no-fault state, which means you don't even need a reason per se to get divorced. You're not saying to the court, I'm divorcing this person because they were unfaithful or they were abusive or whatever the case may be. You're just going in and you're saying you want a divorce. So we can push this forward regardless of her emotional timeline, and you will get divorced at the end of the day.
Okay, so let's stick with Sam and Julia since we've been talking about them. So we've said that Sam has filed, and let's say that Julia, refuses to sign or respond to anything. She's not responding. And he's panicked. He's like freaking out, right? Because she's not doing anything. What if she never does anything? Like, what if she just never responds? What would happen?
So at that point, we're going to be talking to Sam about it's time to, and in our hypothetical, Sam already filed. So at this point, let's say if he didn't file, we're going to say, Sam, here's our options. You can go ahead and file and we get her served. And that's really how you take this to the next level. So if Sam has some sort of timeline where he's got to get this done, and honestly, the most common timeline here, let's be real about it, is that Sam, he might be engaged to somebody else. I just want to put it out there like that.
Oh, he's engaged. Is there a baby involved? I feel like babies move it up really quickly.
A baby could be involved in it. I mean, Sam was emotionally checked out from this marriage 2 years ago. He may, maybe they've even been separated in a certain degree or a certain way. Whatever the case may be, Sam has this timeline. He's like, I cannot wait for her to get emotionally on board and aligned with my timeline. I need to move this forward. What can we do? And the short answer is we get this case filed and we get her served. Once she's served, she has 30 days to respond to the divorce papers. And if she doesn't, then we can move to something called a default divorce. And a default divorce is where you go into court and you say, Judge, we filed for the divorce. We got her served. We gave her 30 days to respond, and she hasn't filed anything with the court. So we want to end this on these XYZ terms. And if Julia doesn't respond to anything and she's just radio silent, and she's going to be getting legal notice of all of this happening, so she's really going to have to put her blinders on and ignore all of it, then the judge will say, okay, divorce is done. Here's the divorce terms, and Sam is on his way. So these default divorces, as they're called, they do happen. They're not totally uncommon, but they pose some very specific issues, if you will. They can be problematic.
Yeah, Julia, I don't recommend that. It feels like it's not a good deal for you. If you don't respond, then you're not able to participate in the decisions of coming up with what it looks like to divorce and to potentially divide your property, your assets, if you have children. I mean, it's not a good idea for Julia to not respond. You would agree, right, Bobby?
Julia's got to get her head out of the sand. And despite the fact that she was just, blindsided by this divorce, she's in a really tough spot because she's got to emotionally navigate her own grief, anger, resentment, whatever the case may be. But she also needs to get a lawyer. And this is one of the reasons that lawyers can be so helpful in this process, because we're not emotionally attached to the process. So it's like, okay, Julia, just hire a lawyer. Let them worry about legally protecting you. That's easy for them. For us, making sure that Julia is in a place where she's just going to totally get the short end of the stick. That's easy. We can do that very simply. There's just a few steps that we need to take to make sure she's in a good position. And then she can do what she needs to do to handle the emotional side of things.
Yeah. So that kind of moves us into how you can help reduce that resistance and then invite cooperation, right? So, how can you sort of shift that feeling of, head in the sand to be like, now, come on over here. We need to talk about this. Like, as an attorney, what are some of the tactics to help those conversations get started?
Yeah, I think it starts, it starts before we tell our spouse that we want a divorce. I think it starts with while we're in the marriage, if things aren't going well, we are actively addressing it. If we put our own head in the sand during the marriage and don't want to address the problems, we just want to let them fester, or we don't want to invite our spouse to go to therapy or counseling, and then the problems fester and they get to this place where it's just too much and you think it's too far gone, and then you tell them I want a divorce and they're blindsided. You've set yourself up for having a not very diplomatic divorce. Whereas if we can go to marriage counseling and talk through these things, and maybe then within the context of having a marriage counselor or a therapist, explain to them and come to the resolution that a divorce is necessary, we're on such better footing than if we kind of go down our own, avenue by ourselves and come to that conclusion. That's really where it starts.
So let's keep our hypothetical going. And I'm going to stick with Sam and Julia here. So, Sam has told his wife, we're getting divorced, filed. And let's say during that emotional process, Julia she just shuts down. She just completely shuts down. That's what happens when she's emotionally processing it. And now he's scared that, everything is going to get worse because she's spiteful. What do you do in that scenario when it turns to that?
So I think Sam needs to figure out how to slow things down for the sake of getting through this. And especially if they have kids, this is going to get very bad if he doesn't work on giving her space and trying to rebuild that bond between them. And this is going to probably be a years long process. So, on one hand, he could go to his lawyer and say, I just want to push this forward. And they file, get her served. And then she has this just like raging resentment inside. At the same time, they're trying to co-parent with each other. And it just seems nearly impossible. So whatever that pressure is that Sam feels to get this divorce done quickly, he needs to relieve it. And whether it's he does have this other relationship with someone, he needs to talk with them and get them to understand that slowing down this whole process is the best way to go. Or if it's just maybe his own desire to get this done quickly, he needs to resolve that within himself. Because if we can't get Julia on board with this, it's going to take a lot longer.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we've talked about this before that, time really is, it's very healing. And when you have a lot of spite, I feel like it's hard to get going, right? So I love when you say, let's slow it down to speed it up, because if you're trying to negotiate or have conversations with a lot of spite, you seem to like always hit these walls and just arguments and you can't agree. But if you can let just a little bit of time go by and maybe just emotionally in a little bit of a better place, it seems like those conversations go so much better and you're able to really figure out a lot in a short amount of time, right? So that, when you are able to kind of slow it down, as you say, then you can kind of speed it up because people have had a little bit of time to process it. And at some point, they're going to probably eventually want to also get the process going as well, because if they realize, okay, I really am going to get divorced, at some point, you've got to figure out what that's going to look like, right? I mean, you can't just stay in that state of not responding, or like you said, the judge is just going to decide for you. And that's not a good outcome.
That's not a good outcome. And it's really hard to co-parent with that outcome. And most people do come around. Most people do come around and realize that the writing is on the wall. And it's not going to be like this straight line process where you give them time and then you have a really productive conversation and it just works perfectly. It's like you're going to have some conversations with them where it gets really emotional. And then you have to say, okay, we need to pause and come back to this maybe in a week or something. And then you might have another conversation where it gets emotional. Like it might take 2, 3, 4 of these conversations for this person to go through their process and realize that it's going to be easier to cooperate than to resist. So don't get me wrong. I don't think that there's some magical words that you can say here to just make it all, la-di-da and easy peasy. But you need to respect don't be pointing the finger at them. Don't be blaming them. Try to find mutual interests when you're having these conversations. Talking to them about the kid's stability, talking to them about figuring out a fair split of the finances, talking to them about keeping things as private and stress-free as possible. You can propose mediation to them, maybe give them some materials on collaborative divorce so that they understand, you may want a divorce, but it doesn't mean that you don't completely still respect them and maybe even love them. Just because you want to get a divorce doesn't mean that you want to make this a painful process for them. And communicating that is key.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really big on expectations too. And I feel like if you just have the expectation that there's really no way to get out of a divorce without a lot of difficult conversations. I mean, that's just how it's going to go. So in some ways, it's if you just have that expectation that I know this is going to be hard, I know this is going to be uncomfortable, I am probably going to have highs and lows of my emotions going through this process. But you have to go through it to be able to get on the other side, because that's when, once everything's kind of done, you're able to sort of, start to move on. But you have to have these conversations, even though they're difficult. And like you said, we don't want to act like it's easy, because these are really hard, really, really hard to have. Okay. So we're going to continue on here with our hypothetical. All right. So Sam has filed. 6 months have gone by, Bobby. 6 months have gone by. And Julia still won't respond. She won't give financials. Nobody's moving out. How do we get it going? We've given her this time to emotionally process. He's trying to be respectful, but honestly, there's no movement of the dial. What do we do?
Well, Sam, I give you credit for certainly trying to make this work in an agreeable way, but sometimes it's just not possible. But we need to move this along. So what are we going to do? Well, we need to get some financial information on Julia. Maybe she's the breadwinner, or she has substantial assets, and we need to figure out what she actually has, but she's not turning over anything. So we're going to start sending out subpoenas. There's two ways that we can get financial information in a divorce. We can either do it through what's called discovery. Well, let's say there's 3 ways. Voluntarily, you can just exchange the information with the other side. That's the best way. There doesn't need to be a court order saying you have to give all this financial information over to the other side. You can just do it voluntarily, and that's what happens in the best, easiest, most sane divorces, is people just go, okay, what do you want from me? Let me give it to you, because I know a judge would order me to do it anyway. So that's the first easiest way. The second way to get financial information is through the discovery process. And that is where you're formally giving them requests and they have to respond. And if they don't, then you can go to court and say, I want sanctions against this person. And that's a way of forcing the issue. But that only applies if the other side is actually cooperating in the divorce to some degree. If Julia is not even cooperating, she's not even showing up to court, she hasn't filed what's called an appearance in court, then you probably are going to have to send out a lot of subpoenas. And subpoenas are requests to third parties. So you're not sending them to Julia, you're sending them to Julia's bank. So I'm sending subpoenas to Chase, Bank of America, whoever she banks with, and they're legally obligated to give us basically everything that we ask for to a certain degree, but there's rarely issues there. And they don't care. They don't have any, I'm sorry to say, but Chase doesn't have any emotional investment in your divorce. So they get this legal document, their legal team looks it over, sends it to whoever processes it, and then we get 2 years of bank statements without having to pull teeth with Julia. So We're going to send out a lot of subpoenas to get a complete financial picture, and then we can present those documents to the judge and let the judge know, okay, we know that there's a bank account with Chase. We know that there's investment accounts with Fidelity. We know these are the balances, and so we're proposing that we split it in this sort of way. So it's there. We have tools in our legal toolbox to make this happen. And that's basically what it comes down to is like, Julia, if you're not going to participate, then you don't really get to make any sort of arguments in court. And it might be in her benefit to be able to come to court and say, well, I don't think he should get this percentage of my 401k because XYZ legal reason, but she's opted not to participate. So she's probably going to get a shorter end of the stick.
Yeah. The more I hear you talk about this, the more I feel like it just makes so much sense to be collaborative, to go ahead and just voluntarily give, your financials to make sure you participate in this experience because, when you don't, it takes more time, it takes more money, and you lose out on having agency for yourself of what you potentially want out of this divorce. So no matter how hard it is, it just seems like you've got to push through and just be an adult and have these conversations because that's the way that, the divorce is hopefully going to go well for both people, right? So as we kind of wrap this up, there's a lot of power in how you respond. And so, you can't make someone want to get a divorce, but you can try to handle it in a certain way, right? So what would sort of just kind of be your final like words and thoughts to someone who knows that they want to get a divorce, potentially who they're married to doesn't want to get a divorce, and how the way they handle it can really make a huge impact on how that divorce goes?
Yeah, understand that the divorce process, if we go through court and we have to use the legal tools that we have in order to force this issue, can take up to 2 years. This is not a quick process if you go into court and you don't have agreement. So if you take that timeline, then you say to yourself, well, would I rather spend 2 years trying to build bridges and maintain a healthy relationship with the mother or the father of my children, or do I want to spend 2 years just creating massive destruction in court? And so if we can really use our time and our emotional intelligence to figure out how to be diplomatic, it is massively in our favor. It's a win-win for everybody. But if it's not possible, there are legal tools. And then on the other side, I would say to Julia, I know you've been blindsided and this is awful and you're probably angry and you're grieving this, but at a minimum, hire a lawyer so they can watch out for your legal back while you process this and grieve through this so that you don't get the short end of the stick.
Yes. Well, Bobby, thank you so much for all of your insight and expertise today. And to all of our to all of our Sams and Julias out there, we hope that you learned something today and can take this advice into your life if you are thinking about stepping into potentially getting a divorce. But thanks so much for being here with us, and we will be back for another episode next week.
Thank you for listening to the Illinois Divorce Guide podcast. We hope today's episode gave you clarity and support as you move forward on your journey. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Tune in next week for more insights and expert advice on the Illinois Divorce Guide podcast.